Okay, I want to talk about EverydayFeminism.com for a few minutes, or several minutes probably. It's basically the most popular feminist website out there these days. Everybody seems to love it. I don't much care for it. It's very much this professional social justiceism stuff. And they publish a lot of articles with numbers in the titles, like 5 ways you can do this and 7 tips about that and 11 things you didn't know about the other thing, that sort of stuff. And they sell these courses, these self-help kind of courses, and they have this speakers bureau. I guess that's the way they make their money, through those things. But the reason I don't like it is because it's founded by / published by a couple of huge abolitionists, sex work prohibitionists. The 2 co-publishers are Sandra Kim and Derek Ellerman. They're a married couple, by the way. And they both come by way of Polaris Project. Sandra Kim used to work there for a few years, a little while back, and Ellerman is one of the co-founders of Polaris Project. And Polaris Project, if you don't know, is the biggest anti-trafficking organization in the United States. It's hugely powerful and influential, and Ellerman and Polaris Project have for years been about the end-demand stuff, encouraging the police to do the raids and the sting operations and, encouraging the government to give the police money to do those things. For example, here's their campaign against the illicit massage businesses. It's drenched in the language of abolition and anti-trafficking. And there is this statistic here about 9,000 illicit massage businesses in the U.S., but if you look at the footnote where they actually got that number is from looking at online review boards to see where commercial sex buyers were saying that they bought sex at massage parlors. And they say they cannot definitively say whether or not trafficking or any other crimes are happening. But that's not going to stop Polaris from encouraging the police and the governments to, spend a lot of money and effort into raiding these places, because some of these women might be in the country illegally. And so they can, call them victims and then deport them without anybody asking any questions. And Ellerman was still sitting on the board of Polaris Project for a couple of years when Everyday Feminism was getting up and running, for the first couple of years there. There was some overlap. And Ellerman's been out there pushing the end-demand stuff for a long time. Just a couple of few examples I'll give you. Here's an article from 2006 that he co-wrote with the other founder of Polaris Project. Typical fear-mongery, moral panicky stuff about the sporting events, large sporting events, that all of the slavers are going to import thousands of women and children for sex slavery at the big game. Hardcore abolitionist stuff. Here's a conference that he was at in 2003, and the panel that he was on was about where do customers find their supply and how is demand manipulated and maintained, which is interesting because they always tell you that it's the demand that's to blame, but if you stick around and listen a little bit longer, the blame always ends up getting sort of shifted back over to the supply. Because the demand is maintained and manipulated through what? The advertisements. That's what. It's the advertisements that do it. And there was a Q&A during this conference, and one of the questions was about, basically what stimulates demand. And Ellerman answers, for example, internet pornography get men addicted for free, they become hooked, and they go to other sources to satisfy their cravings. Pornography sites and dealers have expanded the sex industry by ensnaring more buyers. And there's another question about a model state law. Is anyone working on one? And if there is such a model, is it abolitionist? And Ellerman answers that a state model law has been developed with a protection policy that is abolitionist. And I don't know what kind of protection policy they're talking about, because none of their state model laws certainly ever included the decriminalization of sellers, like they claim they want to do in all of their sales pitches about the end-demand stuff. And here in July 2004, he was testifying in front of Congress about the topic of trafficking in persons. And you'd think this would be the perfect opportunity to mention how important it is to really decriminalize the sellers, because that'll help you to find the real victims and such. Nope, he didn't mention it in the state model laws, and he doesn't mention it here either. It starts off with some tragedy porn type stuff. Oh, we work with women who have been brutally abused, who have been raped. And this was back when they were still admitting that their commitment was to sex trafficking. Not trafficking in general, just the sex trafficking. That's what they used to focus on. And then they got so big, and people kept referring to them as, the experts when it came to trafficking, that they sort of had to start talking about labor trafficking a little bit. And he says that they're in a partnership with the Metropolitan Police of D.C., and they operate a sex trafficking assessment team that accompanies the cops on raids of brothels to conduct culturally sensitive victim assessment services. Ah, yes. So I guess, if you're not assessed as a victim, though, they just arrest you. The cops will still arrest you, I guess, with the Polaris Project people just standing right there, letting it happen. Federal and local law enforcement have the responsibility to proactively investigate commercial sex operations that are similar to networks that have trafficked victims before. Law enforcement should not assume that locations are primarily just places of prostitution. They should verify that trafficking is not present. Unfortunately, too often this is not possible because of resource constraints and prioritization of other crimes. Yeah, okay. If the cops come in to check if there's trafficking, they're not just going to not arrest people. They go in on these raids allegedly to find out if there's trafficking victims, and anyone who's not a trafficking victim but is still selling sex, they arrest those people. You'd think that maybe if everything wasn't all criminalized and stuff and people weren't hiding everything, that it would then be easier to find victims, right? But I guess that's just crazy talk. We must facilitate increased prosecutions if a deterrent effect is to be created, and we must create funding opportunities, in particular for local law enforcement, to give them the encouragement to work more on this issue. Yes, let's create funding opportunities for the police to go in to check if there's trafficking, and then they can also arrest all those prostitutes that aren't assessed as victims while they're at it, right? Great idea. So yeah, the people that run Everyday Feminism are a couple of huge abolitionists, Ellerman especially. And when it comes to the stuff that's actually been published on Everyday Feminism, they've hardly mentioned sex work. If you do a site-specific search for the applicable terms, it turns up 58 results. And as a comparison, maybe not the best comparison, but a comparison, if you search transgender, it gives you like 335 results. And I wouldn't expect the numbers to be equal or anything, but I wouldn't expect it to be such a difference. And most of these 58 results, they're just mentioning the topic in passing. The top 2 results here are really the ones that most specifically focus on it. And the second one, denial, is straight up an abolitionist survivor of prostitution letter. With the whole tragedy story and then the flawed statistics at the bottom. And over on their Facebook page, over there, they've never linked to anything that is about the pro-decrim side of stuff, but they've linked to quite a few things that are abolitionist and end demand in nature. They linked to the Rachel Lloyd book, some article about it, I guess, and it's spreading around the average age of entry is 13, that myth, spreading that around. They linked to an article on Megan Murphy's site, Feminist Current. This was basically a defense of the Swedish model. And in the comments under this post, whoever was handling the Everyday Feminism account at the time themselves are spreading around the average age of 13 is the age of entry thing. And also saying this stuff about how sex traffickers are hanging out at the mall and the amusement parks and the bus stops and train stations and stuff. They could have said dance halls. It would have sounded just fine because they sound like it's right out of 1915 with the white slave panic, right? They linked to an interview with Rebecca Mott. She's one of these abolitionist survivors of prostitution. And in the comments under that one, somebody straight up asks them, "Do you believe that trafficking and prostitution are the same?" And they said, "Nope, certainly not. Nope, we're just using the language that's in the article." Yeah, sure. Okay, sure thing. I get it. You don't really think that prostitution and trafficking are the same thing. You just think that prostitution leads to trafficking. So you have to go after it just as much as the trafficking, right? Right. And there was some other stuff, but I don't want to go through all of it. And the only thing that they've ever published on their site that comes even close to addressing sex work itself, or the sex workers' rights position, is this article about debunking the 6 myths. And it doesn't even really come close. It's really, it's terrible. It's co-written by Sandra Kim, who's the abolitionist founder of Everyday Feminism, and this other woman, Laura Kassir, I don't know how you say her last name, I'll just call her Laura. And she used to do, it doesn't say in her bio on this article, but in another bio I saw of hers, it says that she's done outreach for the sex worker support organization HIPS. So you have basically the abolitionist and the not an abolitionist collaborating on this article, and I think it ends up being a big mess. For example, they say that feminism has historically simplified and continues to simplify this issue. Right, so I guess you're going to unsimplify it with your little numbered list article, your little listicle, right? Sure, okay. And maybe what you know about this issue is informed by the overly simplified media representations of sex trafficking and sex workers, and you're not quite sure you know the difference. Regardless, even you ignorant son of a bitch, you can be an ally for people in the sex industry. It's like, thanks ladies who've never done any sex work yourselves, you've never been in the sex industry yourselves, but you're going to let people know that they can be ignorant as hell and still fancy themselves allies. That's going to be real helpful. And under myth 1, the words we use to describe them don't really matter, and the first sentence here is really something. Our culture views people in the sex industry as trashy, dirty, drug users, victims, survivors, carriers of diseases, bad people, criminals, as sluts and whores. That's a lot of stuff. And, you would think maybe they're going to talk about some of these words, but they don't. They never talk about any of these words. They never talk about how, hey, maybe we shouldn't be stigmatizing drug users or carriers of diseases, and maybe we shouldn't, whatever. They don't talk about any of these words. This whole sentence is in here for no reason whatsoever. The words that they do go on to talk about are prostitute. Some don't mind it, some don't like it. They mention the difference between sex work and people who call themselves sex workers versus people who call themselves sex trafficking, I guess. They don't even put the term for the person here in this part about sex trafficking. It's just the definition of sex trafficking. I guess if you're a minor, you get to call yourself a survivor, but if you're not a minor, I guess you don't even rate, you're not even listed here as to what people should refer to you as. Just victim of trafficking, I guess. But it would have been nice if they'd put that in there instead of just the definition of trafficking. And it's a faulty definition of trafficking, too. But I'll let that slide. And skipping ahead to myth number 5, because it's a real doozy. People in the sex industry should be ashamed for selling their bodies. See, now, I would have thought that the actual myth was that people in the sex industry sell their bodies, as opposed to selling a service. But apparently I'm wrong. The real myth is that they should be ashamed. And it's true that they sell their bodies. And just a couple of paragraphs later, regardless of the reason for them being there, allies should support and work to destigmatize people in the sex industry. Well, gosh, you're doing a really piss poor job of that if you're giving people the impression that it's okay to use phrases like selling their bodies. And myth number 6, people involved in the sex industry are criminals. Correction, they are criminalized. And who is typically targeted by the police and the criminal justice system? women of color, trans women, people selling commercial sex visibly in the street, people under 18 years old, people with criminal histories and histories of drug use, people living in poverty, people who are foreign-born and undocumented. In other words, people already being marginalized and oppressed. Okay, but a better question than who is targeted is why are these people typically targeted? Because the answer to that is that they're targeted because people like Derek Ellerman and places like the Polaris Project tell the police to target these kinds of people. They tell the police to go out and find people that look under 18, people who look foreign-born and undocumented. They tell the police to be on the lookout for people that are marginalized and oppressed because they're more likely to be exploited. They tell everybody to be on the lookout for something that looks like prostitution because it's probably actually trafficking. And make sure to call the police if you see it. You know, these people are typically targeted because Polaris Project and the rest of the end demanders have put the target on their backs. And then in the conclusion, it says, we can stand up for people in the sex industry by fighting against the stigma, decriminalizing them, and providing services to help them be safer. Sounds great, but you're doing a terrible job of fighting the stigma. You're spreading a good bit of that around, in fact, in this article. And as far as decriminalizing them, well, it's always a great talking point. It always sounds good. Of course, they do only mean partial decriminalization. And Polaris Project and Derek Ellerman and Sandra Kim, they could actually raise the alarm. They could actually be saying a lot more about the failures of the government in the state and the federal to actually decriminalize sellers. You know, but they never bother doing that. They just say, oh, we need to decriminalize the sellers. We need to decriminalize people in the sex industry. And then that's it. It's like, that's great. That's great. We all agree. We need to do that. Why aren't we doing that? Why isn't there an article about the failures of the rescue industry, of the end demand NGOs to actually get sellers decriminalized? That's an article I'd love to see here on Everyday Feminism. And then here's the most rage-inducing part. When the voices of people in the sex industry are silenced, their stories ignored, it's so important that we work to listen and to help make their voices heard. Sounds good, right? Sure, it sounds great. Except, I found this page on Google. It's not linked live through their site anymore, but it used to be, I guess, because it's still available on Google, where they were seeking contributing writers to focus on issues regarding the commercial sex industry from the perspective of people in the sex trade. However, applicants should be involved in activist communities supporting people in the sex industry. Not people that have actually been in the sex industry, even though they want it from that perspective. I mean, what the fuck is that? How dare you? How dare you claim that you want to help the people in the sex industry get their voices heard, and then explicitly ask for people who are not involved in the sex industry? You know, this is that typical abolitionist voice of the voiceless stuff. This is how people end up voiceless, because the end demanders out there actively silence them, actively take their voices away. And I'm not just talking about sex workers. This goes for the survivors too. The exited women, the survivors of prostitution. Because I don't see them getting published on Everyday Feminism either. You know, except for that one repost back in 2012. You know, and Everyday Feminism pays their writers $75 a pop. And I'm sure there's tons of people who are either sex workers or survivors or whatever the hell who would love to write an article for them. Our posts will focus on how our culture and institutions need to shift in order to stop stigmatizing, criminalizing, exploiting, and abusing people in the sex industry. Well, that sounds great. Let's focus on how the rescue industry as an institution needs to shift. Let's talk about how Polaris Project and the rest of the end demand NGOs as an institution contribute to the stigmatization and the criminalization. Let's talk about how those NGOs exploit people in the sex industry. How we can move the conversation beyond the current ideological divides and movement politics and how we can reflect the diversity and complexity of experiences within the sex industry. Yeah, okay. Whenever people say they want to get beyond something, oh, I want to get beyond these divides in politics, that's a bunch of bullshit. That's somebody who wants to erase the issue, who wants to avoid the issue, someone who for sure is firmly entrenched on one side of the divide or another, but wants to somehow look like they're taking the high road. Oh yes, that high road where you're going to talk about the diversity and the complexity of experiences. As if we haven't heard it a million times already. How many times can you write that article about how some people choose it and some people don't? And some people do it because they need money, and some people do it for fun. And some people are black, and some people are white. How many times can you write that article where you stop just short of talking about why the police target these certain people? That's where the heart of the issue is. The heart of the issue is in the ideological divides and the movement politics. In the conversations about the solutions that are offered out there to fight this stigma and this criminalization. When apparently, coming from Polaris Project, the solution to the criminalization is just to criminalize some other people. At least that's what they claim they want to do. Decrim the sellers, just criminalize the buyers. But of course, they never actually decrim any of the sellers. But either way, even if they did, it's still just prohibition. And that's what it comes down to, whether or not you think prohibition is going to make things safer. Or you think that prohibition is going to make things more dangerous. I'm firmly in the camp of believing that prohibition makes things more dangerous. It enables more exploitation. It makes it harder to get help when you need it. That's what actually needs to be focused on. But I don't see Everyday Feminism publishing anything like that anytime soon.